Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called The New Jazz Fusion Superstars, or How YouTube Saved Jazz Fusion, right? So it's going to be a strange video because I'm 54 years old, you know. I've been listening to music for about 40 years, seriously. My heaviest sort of music education came in the 1980s. In the 1980s, jazz fusion was struggling at that point. Its heyday had been 10 years before in the 1970s, but there was bands like Tribal Tech and Chicory's Electric Band, was still there. There's a lot of like Fusac stuff around, but I became a huge fusion fan. I followed it through. In the 1990s, there's this sort of explosion with CDs, and CDs became more readily available, and you had labels able to sort of put music out as a sort of minority interest. And labels like Tone Centre were able to stick albums out by Frank Gambale and whoever, Sean Lane. So this is the thing. It's fusion was a big seller in the 70s, but fusion actually has clawed on and survived all the way to that time. It hasn't been supported by the critics. The jazz critics don't rate jazz fusion, and I've spoken about that endlessly on this channel. And so really, with the advent of digital technologies and the move over to computers for creating music, this has really threatened, performing music. Drums and guitar and bass now are a sort of they're a feature. They're not the main way you make music. They're like an adornment that happens now, it seems, in music. But many bands were able to survive through the live scene. Many artists were able to survive off their legacy. With COVID, that's really hit the live scene as well. So a lot of performed music has been under threat, but an esoteric art form like jazz fusion has really been under threat. But it has been saved by YouTube. And there's a number of artists that have almost become household names. And these are jazz fusion artists. I teach young people, 16-year-olds. And if I walk into my class, they don't know who Chick Corea is. They don't know who John McLaughlin is. But they know the people on this list. I've got 10 artists here I want to talk about, only briefly. I'm not super expert on these artists. It's not like if I was talking about Return to Forever, where I've had 40 years of listening to them, studying about them, reading about them. But I've kept my eye out, and there's a whole bunch of fusion guys out on YouTube now. But so much of it is so derivative and safe and hackneyed. They're virtuoso musicians, but you could hear that there's no originality there. I've tried to, get a list of 10, musicians that I really think have done something creative and interesting, and they pushed the boundaries of what jazz fusion is out while still being fusion, and they've also been able to have enough success that many of these are household names, right? So it's a little bit, this list isn't a ranking from 1 to 10. This is a sort of a little bit of a historical ranking, but it's also, if you are a jazz fusion fan and you're my age and you want to check out something new, go and check these artists out and see what you think, and it'd be lovely to have your opinion on it. So the first artist I want to talk about is Dirty Loops. Right, I'm just going to pull my notes up because I wish I knew all this off by heart. Dirty Loops. I first heard about them possibly 10 years ago when YouTube, was starting to really get a grip. People were getting, fast connections at that time, so you could watch video on there, and then suddenly stuff starts to appear. There's lots of grainy phone footage of your favourite artists on stage. And my students come to me and they said, have you checked out this band Dirty Loops? Now, Dirty Loops is a trio from Sweden. I will tell you who's in the band. It is Jona Nilsson on vocals and piano, Heinrich Linder on bass, and Aron Mellegard on drums. And there they are, playing tunes by Justin Bieber, by Adele, but they're reharmonizing them using jazz and jazz fusion techniques. Now this is really interesting because one of the things that jazz fusion does is it solves the problem of how you fuse jazz and rock together, or jazz and funk, by abandoning something that jazz musicians used to do. So jazz musicians would take popular songs and then they would improvise upon those songs. People forget this. When Charlie Parker's playing All the Things You Are, that's a famous song that's liked by everybody. So they know that tune, and then they can gasp at what Charlie Parker's doing with that tune. When we get to the 60s, fusion starts, and people like Ella Fitzgerald and Wes Montgomery, they're trying to do that with Beatles songs. They're trying to do it, but it's not the solution. Fusion doesn't happen until the jazz guys take on what's happening in the progressive end of rock. They listen to Hendrix and they listen to The Doors, and they see how they're improvising, and they see how they're actually being influenced by ideas from modal and free jazz. So we get this modal free jazz thing in early jazz fusion, mixed with progressive elements, which is the more avant-garde end of rock music, and that creates fusion. There's also a heavy funk thing. James Brown, people like Herbie Hancock are channeling that, and we get this funk thing. And this creates a sort of new style, which we're going to call jazz fusion. What Dirty Loops do is they then apply that style to pop music. When I first saw this, I poo-pooed it a little bit, I'd heard it before, but I didn't quite grasp that I hadn't heard this before. It may sound very much like the Brecker Brothers, but the Brecker Brothers didn't do what they're doing. And this approach of taking popular songs and manipulating them so an audience that is outside of the jazz world can appreciate it. Musicians that are coming up that are trying to learn an Adele song, kids then seeing this Dirty Loops and then go, oh my God, what the hell are they doing? And I think Dirty Loops, I'm going to start with them as being the band which really kicks off this YouTube sensation jazz fusion thing. Let's start with them. If you haven't heard them, check them out, And they've gone on to be really successful. They've done an original music, and they're in a really incredible band. And it's really interesting that they're coming from Sweden as well. It didn't come from America. So this is the first really definitive fusion band that is not really channeling America or from America, but I feel like they start something. The next musician I want to tell you about is a guy called Nate Wood. Nate Wood really personifies the virtuoso modern jazz fusion musician. First thing about him, he plays absolutely everything, and the thing with this guy is not only does he play everything, but he plays everything all at the same time. He's an incredible drummer. He's one of the few people on this list that's old enough to establish himself in the normal jazz world. He's played with Wayne Krantz, Chiga Hamasayan, who's another guy that should be on this list who's not. He's played with Sting, he's played with Taylor Hawkins, he's played with Chaka Khan, George Harrison, So this is a session guy, an incredible drummer, really incredible drummer. But he's born in 1979, so he's 20 in 99. He's 20 in 99. So anyone who comes of age in the 90s, he's been influenced not only by jazz, but they'll be influenced by dance music, electronic music, hip hop, trip hop, drum and bass, square pusher. And I hear that in Nate Wood's drumming and playing and his approach. And what Nate Wood does, go and check him out, is he can sit there with a bass on his lap, with an analog keyboard to his right hand side and a drum kit in front of him, and without using loops or any overdubbing, just playing live, he creates music which can take improvisation, draws upon the influences I'm talking about, all that sort of EDM and electronic and the hip hop and all that type of, and draws upon that, and he plays it all at the same time. And I feel this is the other element, is this sort of, YouTube needs a hook, and if you're playing it all at the same time, it's an incredible thing to behold visually. I think Nate Wood is a genius though, because I could quite happily listen to these improvisations. It's not just a trick. Stanley Jordan did this in the early 80s, playing guitar like that and then two guitars. But Nate Wood takes this to an absolutely extreme. It's quite incredible, and I think that spectacle of seeing something live on video, combined with the channeling of these new music forms that have come out of sort of electronic dance music and hip hop, that's another element that's been a big feature of modern YouTube fusion players. Who have I got next on the list? Right, so the next person I want to talk about is Snarky Puppy. So Snarky Puppy decide, you know, they describe themselves as an instrumental, you know, pop band. What Snarky Puppy have pioneered, I think, is the spectacle. So what they would do is they would have bands that were huge, you know, 2 or 3 drummers, 3 or 4 guitar playing, choir, full brass section, you know, 3 keyboardists. And in terms of musically what they do, it's very, very safe. To me, when I first heard them, I thought, well, I've heard this before. This is very high quality jazz fusion. Sounds like the Brecker Brothers. You know, sounds a little bit like Steely Dan. Sounds a little bit like, even like Spyro Gyra. It's bordering on Fusac, but it's heavy enough to be to appreciate it. It's great music. Didn't feel like musically they were pushing the boundaries, but that format, that YouTube format, of having that large-scale band, beautifully filmed, and then lots of cool people around listening with their headphones and nodding, and then bringing in the star soloists. You know, there's so many videos out there where the star of that video is not Snarky Puppy, it's the guest. You know, is it Layla Hathaway? You know, splitting her voice into 2. You know, they've already got somebody in there that really kicks it into gear. That format has become ubiquitous now. All the companies, you know, Zildjian and Fender, and all, they were all doing this. You know, this beautifully shot, high quality, in the studio session, and it's got all the cool riffs and the cool licks. Now, you know, me being an old guy, when I first saw this, I went, oh, but the musically, I'm not too sure. It's incredibly played, but am I hearing anything new? But again, this is an old guy not quite getting it. And as time's gone on, I've gone, no, the Snarky Puppy, again, have pioneered something. So what have we got so far? These are all the elements of the new YouTube sensations that I'm covering here. One is the reworking of popular music. So people got something to hook onto. The drawing upon electronic dance music, hip hop, you know, drum and bass. The spectacle, doing 2 things at once, you know, being able to play 2 instruments at once, or move from one room to the next, or some sort of visual thing happening, which is interesting. And then the sort of super session, you know, with the low level lighting and the headphones and all the cool people, and they're nodding because they're into it and we feel we should be into it. These are the elements of jazz fusion now. This is the thing, and this is almost like memes. It's meme driven jazz fusion. This has become very important. So who have I got next? I've got 2 bands here, Wolfpack and the Fearless Flyers. To me, very similar to Snarky Puppy, except they start out a lot more sort of do it yourself. You feel that everything's being played live. They're really channeling the funk. They're a lot funkier. And you feel like these are guys that have got together in their living room, put a camera on, and they're recreating classic funk grooves, by whatever means. This is a spectacle where they're banging a lampshade, or they've got a ton of towels over an old drum kit, you know, lots of interlocking James Brown stuff. Wolfpack have done this, and then there's a side shoot with the Fearless Flyers with the incredible Nate Smith on drums. And Nate Smith is one of these musicians that has sort of established himself, and he's an established player. He's played with all sorts of stuff. I think he played with John Patitucci at some point, but he has really been able to become a household name amongst musicians through YouTube. If I'm talking to young drummers, they will not know who Vinnie Colaiuta is, but they will know who Nate Smith is. Let's go back. Let's have a look at another thing now. In the 90s, we had neo soul, and neo soul was like a sort of jazzy version of soul. Erykah Badu, Jill Scott, to some extent Michelle Ndegeocello, D'Angelo, Maxwell, and this was it was soul, but it was drawing upon jazz, and at the same time drawing upon hip hop grooves. Hip hop throughout the 90s is channeled a lot by a whole ton of people. The M-Bass guys are doing it. Even Miles Davis is doing it with doo-bop. It's a thing that happened in the 90s. That sort of neo-soul hip-hop jazz approach has been personified by an incredible jazz pianist called Robert Glasper, and that's the next musician I want to mention on this video, who has really taken neo-soul and hip-hop and pushed it to an extreme and really opened 2 channels. One is going back to acoustic piano jazz, and one is really going back to loop production, bass music. And again, the drummer he's used on that, which is a guy called Chris Dave, is a definitive drummer. Incredible. The next musician I want to talk about is Thundercat. Right, Thundercat is a virtuoso jazz bass player, and I'll just pull some information about him because I have forgotten his real name. I thought I would be able to remember this, but his real name, Thundercat's real name, is Stephen Bruner. And he has a brother called Ronald Bruner Jr., who I heard first. I saw him drumming with Stanley Clarke, an incredible virtuoso drummer. But Thundercat could have just been one of the new breed of incredible jazz fusion players out there. But he starts to pick up from cultures, from video games, from TV shows. He's actually named after Thundercats, which is an 80s TV show. A sort of postmodern take on sort of historical, meme-driven cultural references. And he brings that into his music, and that changes his music. And by doing that, he has been able to elevate himself to a point where he was in, was it The Mandalorian or was it Boba Fett? He acted in Boba Fett. He's crossed over into culture. When Kendrick Lamar wanted to make his jazz progressive rock epic To Pimp a Butterfly, he went to Thundercat to do it, and Robert Glasper, and that album has propelled these people into a superstar level. I'll talk about Thundercat in a minute, but one of the few albums I've actually bought, jazz fusion albums I've actually bought over the last few years, was his album Drunk. And Drunk is an incredible album. It's funky, it's avant-garde in places, but he's also drawing on almost like yacht rock, Hall & Oates, Kenny Loggins, who I think is a guest on the album. Incredible stuff. Thundercat is a musician you need to check out. Right, who's next on my list? And I apologise, Thundercat, for not remembering your real name. Right, so the next artist I want to talk about is my favourite of the new fusion superstars, and this is Louis Cole and his band Noah. Louis Cole is very influenced, and I think taught by Nate Wood. He's another virtuoso multi-instrumentalist that plays everything but he's focused around drums, but he also sings as well. He's drawing on Miles Davis, Jack Johnette, that heavy sort of space jazz that Miles did in the 70s, but he's kind of combining that with EDM, he's combining that with drum and bass, and he's combining that with an almost Beach Boys approach to songwriting that I feel is channeled a great British neo-soul artist called Lewis Taylor. And Lewis Taylor deserves his own video on my channel, and I will do it at some point because I am a huge Lewis Taylor. Louis Cole and his band Noah have pioneered sort of a meme-driven, do-it-yourself, we're just in our living room doing this insane stuff and there's an event going on, all that type of stuff they've pioneered. But they actually sort of came to fame by doing the same thing as Dirty Loops, by reworking songs by Lady Gaga. Louis Cole's really into his chords, and he's got a harmonic approach which is all his own. I think the guy's an absolute genius. He's the real deal, and if there's one person at the moment of these sort of YouTube sensations that we need to keep our eye on, it's Louis Cole. I think he's going to go down in history of one of the greatest jazz fusion and one of the great musicians of all time. Right, the next person or duo that I want to talk about is JD Beck and Domi. Right, I cover music from 50, 40 years ago. Even when I'm talking about Dirty Loops and Nate Wood, some of these musicians have been around for 10, 15 years. In the case of JD Beck and Domi, these musicians have really been around for about 2-3 years. Right, they're a keyboard drums duo, both incredible virtuosos with a unique, almost like psychic ability to improvise together. JD Beck has taken that sort of EDM approach that Louis Cole's doing on drums and Nate Smith's doing, that Nate Wood's doing, and he's gone even deeper into this. Incredibly fast hands that are able to emulate an almost machine-like drum and bass approach to drumming. Domi is a fully fledged jazz keyboard virtuoso, and together they do duo gigs. They've just come out with a new album, and it's absolutely fantastic. I feel like they are another group that's we need to look out for. All these artists I'm talking about are different to the mainstream jazz fusion that's being pushed out. There's something about them which is novel. Two more musicians I'm quickly going to mention. One's the bass player Mono Neon. You know, Mono Neon is a virtuoso bass player that came to the fore, basically mimicking people talking, people ranting on YouTube, and he would mimicking. Really come from Frank Zappa, but he's also got this sort of New Orleans funk thing going on, and he's got this Dada-esque image. It's like what Thundercat's done times 10 with, like, you know, all the multicolours and abstract, you know, shapes that he plays in. His face is covered up by things. He's got a sock hanging off the end of his bass. All really iconic. All these musicians understand the importance of the visual because they've come through YouTube. And the last musician I want to mention to come up with the 10 is the British musician Jacob Collier. I don't think I appreciated Jacob Collier when he first came out. He's an absolute virtuoso musician, able to play absolutely everything. He came to the fore creating sort of a cappella versions of pop songs where he did multiple overdubs, and then they would suddenly explode into him playing all these instruments. The thing, I think when I first saw Jacob Collier, it just looked like showing off to me. But as time has gone on, I've realised that Jacob Collier is a pop star. He's a singer, and he's making incredibly highly sophisticated pop music, which is drawing upon jazz fusion, as is now Louis Cole and Noah. So this is all interesting stuff. I've got to the end of the video now. I'm going to finish up there. I'm going to return to this, but here I've introduced you to 10 artists. Go away, your homework's to go away and check them out if you don't know them. Come back in the comments and tell me what you think. And if I will do a couple of videos on some of these artists specifically. Anyway, that's the end of my video. I'm going to finish up there. Again, thanks for watching. If you like, you know, if you want to subscribe. And if you want to support me, there's a Patreon link below, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.